Went very quickly. We usually do it for much longer, but I thought, the theme you could do in 1 month as opposed to doing 10 weeks or, what do we usually do, 10 weeks?
I think yours usually
8 to 12.
Eight. And Michael does.
Michael is all bets are off. Michael is
doesn't matter.
on never ending.
yeah.
Artos decided the same, basically. Endless.
Oh, he keeps extending the class?
He says they're never going to get through the material, so
Oh.
it'll be indefinite.
Die, why? You get the material, you die first.
Last time we were discussing, of course, a couple of the chapters from the book on Left-Liberalism. But the discussion in the latter half really turned to, I think, the question of constituent power last time. So I think we're ending with the right reading, certainly. Negri on constituent and constituted power. And we read chapters 1, 5, and 6, which is on, of course, the categories of constituent power and its vicissitudes, and then 5 and 6 are more or less on the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, and the problems or the ways in which this question played out in both cases. But his initial observation, I think, which is an important one, is that in the what he calls, I guess, the juridical reading of constituent power, the radicality or the democratic character of constituent power is eliminated, because constituent power becomes simply a moment in the creation of constitutions, as it were. And then afterwards, it kind of vanishes, or it only remains in a very muted way, in that you have some kind of a popular assembly or legislative body that presumably represents becomes the stand-in for constituent power, but of course it loses its constitutive capacity, because you have, of course, all the limitations on what can be done to begin with, and who does it, which is representation rather than some kind of a more direct popular participatory moment. And I think here also we have the distinction between the people and the multitude. In his way, it's a critique of, I think, Hobbes and the liberal tradition, because for Hobbes, the many become the one, the multitude becomes the people, because they are represented by one voice. So you lose the plurality of the multitude, that the equalness, in a sense, and the radicality of the many, and you reduce it to the homogeneity and conservative character of the one. Because for Hobbes, certainly, the many was a great danger, had to be eliminated through the social contract into the one. And Negri goes back to what is certainly, I think, probably the most significant thinker of constituent power, which is Machiavelli. And Machiavelli, who was, of course, almost always greatly misread and misunderstood, exactly on this purpose. That for him, it was the many who are the generators of political power. And the question of how you make a certain, polity had to do with the many, not with the people at the top, certainly. There's also, of course, the fact that Machiavelli was completely and viciously secular, none of this religious mumbo-jumbo, which is important in this case, because the question of constitution, once you have the recognition that it is us who constitute, who are the constitutors of the political world, and that opens up the question, well, how should we do it, and under what form should we do it? It is very much, of course, a challenge to the ancient regime and to the Catholic Church, and all those traditions that assert that the constitution of our social world certainly comes from outside of us, some kind of divine moment, as the creator. So the Catholic Church, of course, they understood enough to know that what he was saying was not, was to be opposed, and you have all of these, Machiavelli as a satanic figure, as evil, all these kinds of things. And I think of course, in the United States, you see it very clearly, this juridical understanding of constituent power, how it becomes more or less we have this myth of, the revolution, the founding fathers, and so forth. And now the question is simply being faithful to the constituted powers.
Oh, like I see that the moment, there was a moment, the moment
Yes.
is over.
That's right.
We're faithful
That's right.
to the moment.
Yeah.
Right, that makes sense.
Revolution.
So here we see, I think, quite clearly if the question if let's say is broadly left legalism, or the limits of legal thinking and legalism, that we see what we already knew, of course, but we see as one of the first big problems, which is the alienation of political agency from the many into the hands of the few, by way of this shift from the primacy of constituent to the primacy of constituted power. And the lack of capacity for that to change, how difficult it is. I mean, maybe on paper, there are some procedures through which constituted power can be changed, but of course it is not easy, and there's no real active engagement of people, of the multitude, as agents in their own right. Which is part then of when discussing the French Revolution, for example, and the Paris Commune, which is another very important example. Part of what he points to as the constituting moment not only transforms, let's say, the institutions, also transforms the subjectivity of the participants. So it's a kind of necessary moment to go from a moment of, let's say, domination and heteronomy to be able to be active participants and have power, as members of the multitude. That you have to it's a kind of an educational process too, that going through that revolutionary struggle. That, of course, from this contemporary standpoint is long, to whatever degree it might have existed at some point. And you can think maybe to examples of something like, maybe Sherry's Rebellion, where the people who had fought in the revolution, having taken on a certain way of understanding themselves as the agents of, the creators of this then new political situation, had also the power to remake it. So we'll take our guns and we'll go to Boston and we'll kill these people, try and take our farms, and we'll start over again.
They misunderstood.
Well, they didn't misunderstand, but they needed a few more guns apparently. And of course, he has a significant section also on violence, of course, as the founding. The violent origins of new constituted, entities. How violence is a necessary, and omnipresent element of that, and how it gets covered over after the fact through these kinds of legalisms. He goes back to Marx's chapter 5 in Capital. He sees that really as the source, as a source of Marx's analysis of constituent power in examining the primitive accumulation and the origins of capitalism. How you have that violent constitutive moment that later gets covered over and kind of, rationalized and legalized, but is always there. as a foundation.
I mean, I think Negri does a really good job of showing how the dynamism of constituent politics subsequently desiccates and become reified in the constituted order, and how that's insufficiently democratic in many ways. But I found myself thinking about, in a sense, like what the plane of what he calls the temporality of constituent politics is outside of revolutions. So I mean, I think he is right in seeing revolutions as the time of constituent politics, but that temporality does become closed because the Shays Rebellion, it's like they didn't have enough guns or whatnot, right? And so that opening closes, and then so what does that mean subsequently? And just thinking about where we are now, and where are the spaces of constituent politics. And then I was, of course, also then thinking about whether, the kind of diagnosis that he comes up with here has to do with, I don't know if this came before or after Multitude, an empire.
Before.
Right?
This came out in 92.
Mm-hmm.
The translation is 99.
And was
Multitude Empire was 2000.
Yeah. And, there are...
But you see a lot of the ideas already in here.
And I don't like the direction that he goes to an empire.
Right.
So I kind of also wonder if these are the reasons, but I think there's much to save here. But I think one of the key premises of empire, for Hardt and Negri being that you kind of go outside of state politics in many ways, but you do that by finding new spaces of political action, but that's obviously not juridical, but that also doesn't confront head on the structures of constituted politics.
Yeah. I mean, the question between space and time is significant. He sees the French Revolution as recapturing the temporal, radicality of constituent power, as opposed to the more liberal, he says, moments that preceded it would see it as being somewhere else. The democratic or the radical potential is in the new world. Somewhere you go and you escape the old and you can kind of reinvent yourself, move west, the frontier, whatever. Whereas here it's temporal. We will remake the society, not escape to somewhere else, but refashion, reorient the society as it is. Yeah, this came out in 92, and I was thinking maybe it's some way connected to the fall of communism and communist regimes, because at that point, there were all kinds of discussions about constitution and constitutionalism. In Hungary and in Poland and all these places, it was they were kind of refounding themselves, and maybe as a reaction to that kind of legalistic way in which things turned there, which more or less foreclosed any kind of popular political activity. Even though there was a moment of potentiality. There's always a potentiality in that moment of this destruction and that moment of reorganization. But it happened along very liberal lines. So I was thinking maybe that was part of the impetus for him writing this when he did, as seeing what was playing out in Europe at that time. Some of the things we see later, like the tension between multitude and people, or nationhood. But
can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I didn't actually get time to read, so I'm asking a somewhat ignorant question. So the way that he says it is, you have these great moments of revolution and a new order is established, right, that is then kind of solidified and constituted. And then is every kind of display or kind of instance of constituent power after that sort of just subsumed within that juridical order, or are there kind of, is it possible for there to be somewhat revolutionary but sort of mini moments after that are sort of within the order but kind of force it to reform in to the will of the people? that create openings, or is it all then unless you have the big rupture, are you just trapped at that, until that big rupture comes, like in his view?
No, I don't think it's some kind of. I mean, it ends up the French Revolution becomes conservative then with the kind of the Thermidorian moment. The Americans, of course, very quickly it becomes very conservative. In the case of the Russian Revolution, once you have the elimination of the Soviets, when you have that tension and that part loses out and it becomes party bureaucracy, bureaucracy that take form, then the democratic or radical constitutive moment gets lost. But I think, obviously part of the idea is it could be otherwise, or we can, looking at all these lessons from the past, we get some insight about what maybe doesn't work or what might work as a way of maintaining.
What would it look like in?
Well, it's some kind of a popular assembly. First of all, we could say that, and he says it directly, that legislative power always has to be paramount. Number one, the legislative moment, and he says, in Rousseau he makes a distinction between legislative and executive power, but it's not meant to be a distinction of the way we think of it, let's say, as, separate bureaucratic institutions and so forth. It's a distinction between the coercive moment, let's say, and the creative moment. That you create, let's say, the new laws or something, and of course you also have the coercive apparatus to implement it and to bring it into being. Today we have the opposite. We have the primacy of executive power over legislative power. Who cares about the city council in New York City, for example? It's all about the mayor. Or of course, the same thing in when it comes to the national government, and not only, of course, we have in Russia or in most societies you have this ever greater push towards executive power. So that in and of itself is fundamentally incompatible with a democratic moment.
I have a follow-up question to that. So on page 12, he says the last paragraph says, in this way, he says, thus, by insisting on the concept of constituent power as an absolute process, all-powerful and expansive, unlimited and unfinalized, we can begin to appreciate the originality of its structure. So I'm just thinking how he defines it, that being a process, expansive, unlimited, and unfinalized. Does it mean that the revolutionary forces, which are representative of constituent power, happening all the time, and it's kind of up to us to find them and seize that moment? I'm just thinking, are they all happening in pockets?
I think one idea is you cannot limit that. Once you start limiting what constituent power can do, once you impose control from some instituted power, let's say, over the constituent power, then you are deviating from the democratic or radical character of that power. If you say, because some of the examples he gives, well, he says, look, when they had the in France, he gives some examples where people demanded the immediate, the possibility to immediate recall the people who are in office. That always they have, the multitude have the power in the last instance. So, but I don't know if we're.
Oh, I'm just
12.
12. Yes.
Yes, the bottom, the last
12,
paragraph.
the last paragraph.
Confronted by the crisis.
No, in this way. In this way.
Is that the page that says 12:3?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't
One
get that,
baby.
but
I don't understand this
Oh.
whole thing.
Because the next page
So
doesn't
that's
have
page
the
13.
number, so
That's
that's
page-
page. No, it's
that's
12.
page
The next
13.
page is page 13 because it doesn't
No.
have a number. Yes.
This is 12. Because
Okay.
you're seeing it linearly You see, this is 12, this is
Yes,
13, that's why I couldn't find it.
Okay, so yes, 13.
Oh, this
Yes.
is 13?
Sorry, yes, but yes,
No,
it
the
is
thing that I was not
not.
understanding was literally the structure
It
of the
is-
pages and why
But
they
it's
were
just
arranged
such a, I feel like this is
like-
just such
It's
a,
part of the test, yeah.
Yeah.
Was the 9? It was the
figured
9.
out, that's how I saw it, I was like, oh, so
How does
12, 3
12
means
have
that the
this?
next one is 3, and then, you know, when it's 12,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
yes,
that it
that's
would be.
13,
That's
4,
not-
or like 15,
Yeah, I feel
5.
that.
But yeah, so it's page 13, page 13. Yes.
Yeah, it's absolute process.
Yes.
Constituent power can do anything.
So, and
There's nothing to limit it, right?
Yes.
There's nothing to limit it, you know, and it creates, you know, and it radically can create or recreate the, you know, the
Yes.
economy, politics, whatever the case may be.
so it's not like its character transforms necessarily when it's defined by juridical norms, but rather our perception of people, the constituents of this power changes, but nonetheless it still exists. And then if we, like, I guess, find this ongoing process of revolutionary forces and then redefine our power, just redefine that power for ourselves, we are able to tap into it and maybe seize the moment. I
don't think he thinks it always exists.
Oh,
Because,
okay.
no, because it gets covered over or overpowered by constituted power much of the time, if not almost all the time.
Right.
But the potentiality is always there, or the creative, that any moment of creation, you know, is this moment of constituent power. And then the question is, can you maintain that energy, let's say, or that primacy, or does it get covered over through the formalization and legalization of
With
things?
sub-
But I'm just
Yeah.
thinking what to do after it's covered over and legalized.
Well, then you
As
have to
Do
recreate, you gotta
revolution.
refound.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
Or you could have that moment.
Yeah, that's what I
And
mean. Like,
keep-
how do you have this moment where you're
Keep the moment alive, shall we
Yeah.
say, and not lose that constituent character of what you, whatever you know, created
Yeah.
or won or whatever. But that means that you're in a constant mode of battle.
yeah,
That
that's
is
what yeah.
untenable
Exactly.
in a certain sense, right?
Well-
Like for folks to be like, then you basically, and I think this is what folks encounter in organising a lot, that you then spend all your time defending the win and trying to influence what happens with the win. That then there's no chance to win other things because you're fully occupied. Like the state has you fully occupied, trying to keep alive the thing that you won as a powerful thing, shall we say, or as a constituent kind of win.
Yeah.
And the only choice you have is either you then get fully occupied in that, or you let it go, and then it becomes the win is effectively neutralized, right? Like it becomes sublimated into the system and a cog or whatever.
And I'm also thinking, like, on individual level, the power of multitude, sure, together, but then the power of multitude doesn't exist if people individually don't, feel that power. So I'm just thinking how to reignite that power on an individual level to create that. So that's what I mean. Like, does it exist somewhere where, I don't know, or after you're able to see that it is covered up and you want to change that somehow? Can you do this individually? Like, can you find this revolutionary pockets and create the momentum and maybe create a moment or come across the moment if those moments already exist?
And I think it presupposes a mass movement. How one individual happens to fall into it or become a participant or not is another question. But I think, you can't have a constituent power without it being a mass movement. By default, by
Right.
definition,
Yeah.
obviously.
But he
The
does go.
multitude is there's no multitude then, if the multitude has been overpowered by the logic of the one, of the people, then it's a rebellion against that.
Okay, I see.
For
I
example.
see.
But he
No.
does designate the subject as the multitude, ultimately. So if
Yeah.
you go to the section where it's from structure
That
to
one,
subject, I don't know what page it is, but he says something about Foucault. Foucault critically performs the process of disarticulation of the real, and then constructively reopens the process that assumes the disarticulation as a positive condition. So maybe in a moment like that, again, going back to what we were saying about Althusser last week, in this kind of identifying of the ideological apparatus or something, you have possibly the moment of identifying the multitude or that constitutive power again. But I think also going back to your point about the, protecting the win, I think he does differentiate between kind of the conservative revolutionary moment that does protect those wins, and then it's a moment sort of orientation where he says that it's about an active mode of revolution rather than defending those wins. You're always supposed to performing, sort of a futural moment of constitution. Ultimately.
So there's something additional to defense.
Right.
There's
Right.
like a posture that is more aggressive.
Right.
Almost a continuous reconstituting.
Right.
And I think that's why he falls on the side of cancel communism when he's discussing the Soviet Union, let's say, right, on the importance of workers' councils in that moment, both as a way in which, people can take on the in that sense, subjectivity, where the subjectivity is created for this constituent power. And of course, that they become the ultimate holders of power within that instituted order. That the instituted order holds up as primary and foundational this in the form of councils, let's say, right? This constant energy and involvement of worker power in that case, or of popular power. But I think it's important to know that it's not a system of representation per se. He's very much opposed to representative government because, again, that implies this logic of the one over the logic of the many, where the many are more or less eliminated because one voice speaks for them. The representative agent, in government, as opposed to a council which people aren't represented. They simply participate. It's not everyone who participates at the same time, but people are active participants in the legislative body, not people enter as representatives of X, Y, or Z constituencies.
Right.
So there's a different logic there than the one that most people are used to, which is that, we have a legislature, but the legislature, first of all, is subordinate to executive power at this moment, but more importantly than that, they function as the representatives of, rather than they engender some kind of direct participatory moment of popular sovereignty.
And I think the institutional example of the Soviet councils is interesting because now we're looking at a possibility of founding a structure that, maybe is better able to sustain the constituent, energy. I find that confusing though in a sense because it seems to me that he does draw a distinction between constituent politics and constituted politics, right? Like extraordinary politics and normal politics.
Right.
So is what we strive for, or should we strive for establishing institutions, or definitionally is constituent politics in a sense always on the outside?
Well,
that's a good question.
It's inevitable to have institutions. It's not. It's impossible not to have also constituted power, but there's a difference when the constituting moment vanishes into some mythical moment of the past, let's say, and everything is, in that sense, normal, ordinary politics, and when you have the legislative moment completely unfettered and active, that has primacy over all else. So at any moment, you can refound or recreate what had been created at revolutionary, let's say, moment of constitution.
That's not any legislative activity, right? And that's why I think the distinction between normal versus, or like, ordinary versus extraordinary politics holds, because if we're, talking about, oh, like, what's our federal budget going to be? That's a different type of legislative activity than even something like constitutional amendments.
Yes.
And so, like, does that necessarily mean then that constituent politics, and like, I'm actually like not even sure that, like, at least here, that constituent politics would occur within the institutions. Like, again, that's why I feel like it would be like in the interstices somehow, and that's why I'm not sure what those spaces would look like. And
but
whether,
you could have a popular assembly or a constituent assembly, let's say, to use that language, which was not limited in terms of its capacity to recreate or refashion the institutions. So it's not to say everything it did would be a reorganization or recreation of the institutional order of things, but it always had that capacity, let's say, as opposed to how things usually occur now, which is that the Constitution limits the whatever legislative assembly might exist in terms of what it can and cannot do.
So, I mean, already just to clarify then, we're not thinking about, like, going back to representation, just, going about politics as usual, even if it, entails something as significant as constitutional amendments within the existing legislative structures, but we're, talking about, in a sense, like, parallel, like structures of political participation, like maybe popular assemblies, that are not necessarily incorporated into state structures. Is that what you have in mind?
If you had as a legislative body some kind of a constituent assembly, where it wasn't based on the principle of representation, but rather you had some method, let's say, of direct participation by subsets of the multitude, right? It was a sample of the multitude rather than representatives in the name of the people, under the logic of the one. Then they would have to have the power, right? That body has the power to redo anything it feels like doing. Is not to say it doesn't do also the normal things, passing a budget, let's say, making a decision about some legislative issue. But at the same time, it can also always reorganize, refound, recreate, reconstitute.
Wait, I mean, I'm sorry, just to clarify there, like, are you thinking about a constituent assembly just in terms of some type of a political timeline, as something that we might do in order to get to a point of refounding? Or are you like already kind of like presupposing that to have happened and the constituent assembly is already in place and we see that instead of a representative legislative body as a way of conducting politics?
I think it's the latter. Because always they have also the capacity to, a democratic logic or the logic of constituent power, unfettered, would be one where we can make any change at any time. That there's no limitation to that agency. So, of course, is not always a moment of reconstituting what has already been constituted. But if you're going to have, whether it's through council communism or some other form, you always have to have the capacity of that popular constituent body to reconstitute if it wants to.
I'm happy to, and like I think it's interesting to think about what those arrangements might look like, but like I at the same time feel like then we would be discussing a kind of an ideal type. And for me, in a sense, like the more urgent task, or like equally important, would be to think about how that type of a system even like could come into existence. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one fundamental principle is the primacy of, like we say, legislative power above all else, and secondly, the elimination of any norms or constituted institutions that curtail or limit the agency of that legislative moment. Because what do we have? We have in contemporary liberal society constituted politics that violate, let's say, both principles. On the one hand, they place severe limitations, not all of them, but many of them, on what the legislative moment within politics can do. You know, there are things that presumably cannot, you know, in the American case, right, say you cannot violate people's property rights, the right to free speech, whatever it is, right? There's a whole limit of limitations to what can do, and there's a whole limit of limitations in terms of what this institution or agency has the power over as opposed to others. Secondly, again, it eliminates the multitude under the logic of collective representation in the hands of state officials or, you know, public servants or whatever, as they become then the stand-in for the people. So you lose the multitude and you lose the primacy of legislative power. So in terms of practical, let's say, you know, it's not, okay, we're going to have an ideal type that we contrast everything to, but it's not simply that. As a measure of radical potentiality, let's say, or as a measure of democratic versus non-democratic power, I think both would have to be there. That you have the multitude maintains its full, let's say, diversity, doesn't become subsumed under the logic of the one, and at the same time you have the primacy of legislative power over all else. There's no external limitation that says, well, you can do some things, but you can't do this. You know, we don't give you that power. It always has to be, again to use that language, an autonomous body. There can't be a moment of heteronomy where some other imposes on you some limitations, and you are bound by those limitations. If it's a real constituent assembly, can do anything.
I have a question about the relationship between the state and the people. For Negri, is it does he presupposes the illegitimacy of the state? Because you said the diversity of multitude being, you know, echoed, represented, but being essentially represented by the government, because time always changes and then diversity of multitude always changes. Would that mean that he sees the relationship between the state and the people as always a struggle, and that's where our power is?
No, I think, well, first of all, I think he would be, depends what you mean by the people. He would be against the logic of the people, because the people presupposes the many become subsumed into one body, one subjectivity.
Yeah.
Let's say, right, that the nation or whatever, whatever the category might be. He's in favor of the multitude, the idea of the many.
So like no nation states.
No nation, no people.
Oh
Yeah.
wow! Oh.
And then there's
Kumbaya.
the third category, the juridical methodological,
Yeah.
which is yes and no, I guess.
What is the,
This is really.
what is the juridical methodological? I didn't get that.
There is a more confusing that was a more confusing section.
Oh, great, confusing.
That's in chapter 1, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I missed it. What page is it? Real or otherwise?
24.5 is the nation, and then the third category would be the next page. The third hypothesis, constituent power as subject, is already materially defined by juridical mechanisms inherent in its composition, and the constituent power is itself a multiplicity of juridical powers set in a singular relationship, such that the elements of juridical mediation are always necessarily presupposed.
Wow.
Let's see, what does he say?
From this point of view, which is eclectic but still effective, the possibility that constituent power is represented as absolute
Whoa,
procedure.
are you on 24.5?
No,
Next
20,
one.
26. There's no
The
.5.
last
24. Okay.
26.
26.
It's 26.
It doesn't have a
24
page
to
number.
26.
It goes from I'm sorry,
It goes from 24.5, as you said, the next page. It's not 0.5.
the next page is
So it keeps
26.
talking,
It
yeah, like
doesn't
first
have a number.
hypothesis, second and third,
Blank.
yeah?
It's blank.
Is the nation.
Is this
Oh
like
my
the
God,
gender
I missed
thing?
that. It's like I wasn't reading and totally missed that.
It's here.
On the next page,
You
the
see
last
where the heading
paragraph.
is?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm with you there.
You can blame Michael Hardt, he was the
Yeah.
editor of the series. So.
It was the 90s. Come on.
Yeah.
Okay, third hypothesis, I see. Constituent power is subject to zoning. Briefly
Limitation is
stated-
posed a la Hegel as determination. Mediation and compromise are assumed within constituent power as the subject that founds the material constitution. Not outside, but within it. This is the effectiveness of mystification. This is in fact a matter of mystification because the problem of constituent power cannot be solved by making singularity the limit of its absolute character, a temporal, spatial, and procedural limit. The fact that the absolute character of constituent power lies in its singularity is perfectly evident. But this, and not something else, is the problem. At this point, we could examine other theories that try to connect constituent power to absolute procedure in order to domesticate the former. So it's all, the three things are three ways that he sees that the radical potentiality of constituent power have been
Domesticated.
domesticated or muted or whatever way you want. One is, of course, through the notion of nation, right, and people. One is through this kind of procedural formalism that
That is
that
so
reduce it
bad,
to
though.
Juridical,
Yeah.
procedural juridical.
yeah that reduce it to procedure as opposed to this creative
And people say you
moment that
engineering
cannot be
process.
it's singular, but you cannot reduce it to process.
And by singular, he means the event.
Well, he just connects all the revolutions. He says that it's all part of the same, and then it resurfaces at different places in different forms. But that's essentially.
Well, no, that it
the-
takes a concrete singular in the sense that it takes a concrete. I mean, the
Specific
principle might be
conditions.
universal, but each articulation of that is singular, right?
It's
That's
going to
singular.
time.
That's singularity, right? It takes
Problems.
a
Okay.
very particular concrete form, but you cannot reduce its character to that peculiarity of that singularity. That it took the form of, let's say, Soviets, let's say, right? That it took the form of workers' councils. And then you reduce it to that, which is obviously a easy mistake to make, or easy way that it can be undone. You maintain the formality and you empty it of the
Becomes
contents.
like dislocated.
Yeah.
Maintain the
I
formality.
mean, still, I think even later, the name and the formality of the Soviets were contained later on, but of course they were not really, what once had been popular assemblies, constituent assemblies. And again, this is a real, here he goes through the history of how, the constituent power has been negated or fought against, but it's also at the same time we have to say it's a real serious problem how you maintain this tension between having, the practical day-to-day necessities of doing the ordinary things, as you say, and those moments of complete sovereignty, complete power, including the power to at any moment refound and reconstitute what already is. And I think that constitutive process, whatever that may be, is I think for him still fundamental because it's part of the shaping of subjectivity. How you get people to have that kind of subjectivity is by there actually being the constituent process that they are active within that make and remake.
That's why you said that every generation has its own revolution to fight, and yes,
It
and
should.
that's why it should, to maintain the moment in this
Yeah.
period.
So the subjectivity currently being shaped by our system is one of complete and profound passivity.
Yes.
Even worse.
Yes.
It's even worse than that, because it's not just people are passive. People are passive, and at the same time they idolize and worship constituted power.
Right.
The authoritarian.
Right. They turn away from the constituent, capacities or possibilities in politics, and simply become, in a sense, servile to constituted power. And this is, again, a very deep problem, because even in the most radical of the radical political discourse in the United States don't rise to the level of talking about a refounding or reconstituting of political order or politics. It's all about making things better, fixing problems, more just, more equal, whatever. But it never rise to that radical level. No one argues against the primacy of executive power. No one argues against peoplehood. No one argues against the Constitution, let's say, or the presumed sacredness or higher law status of the Constitution.
I know that definitionally the category of the multitude is supposed to, keep the political field open, and not have it subsumed under, logic of peoplehood or nationhood. Like, I did see that in the book, he does go through different revolutionary instances, right? Even before we get to the French Revolution and later,
Yes.
the Soviet, I think, like with
American,
Machiavelli, right?
yes,
American,
goes Machiavelli, the
English
American.
Revolution, right? So those are the historical instances. I'm still kind of wondering how we can think though about the content of the politics. So of course, he says that there is an intrinsic and necessary link between constituent politics and democracy as such, because it is about this radical openness and about not having, laws or anything dictated by anything outside of who we are.
Right.
So there is that. But I still felt like, at least in the chapter on the French Revolution, I didn't get to the Soviet chapter, that there was enough marks in it. That, because he talks about how at one point that the limitations in a sense of the French Revolution also came from the fact that it was situated in its times and it was still a bourgeois revolution, right? And then still citing a lot of Marx about how then historical and materialist developments and the developments in the forces of production were still kind of getting us to this final conflict, so to speak. So to me though, there is I think a tension between insisting on the one hand this radical openness of democratic politics and still bringing into it I'm just going to be controversial and say a teleological historiography of history developing in a certain direction, and then us then thinking about what constituent politics looks about now. Is are we just going to think about it at the level of why aren't we taking hold of radical democratic politics and say we could just completely redo everything?
Yes.
Or does it also have this other class dimension, and what does that end up looking like? So I think in that respect, the subsection on, I don't think he calls it the social question, but or it was something like
When he
that.
gets into the universality of the working class and
It's in the chapter on the French Revolution.
Yeah.
It's about the sans-culottes and Rousseau.
right.
And about living labor, and how basically the political question ends up entailing the social question. It's a kind of rebuttal against Arendt.
Yes. Arendt, as you know, had argued against the French Revolution as being not about politics, but about economics and, social issues, really. Whereas revolution should be as an American. And she said the best revolution was the American, because it was purely political as opposed to... Of course, this is a big mistake in terms of understanding the relation between, these things, but and a misreading of the ancients. Because the ancients understood that, let's say, the economic moment or the social moment is a precondition for the possibility of politics. They're not separate registers that or separate, or completely separated spheres. That you have to. The one, of course, is a presupposition. If you don't have in terms of economics, let's say, the proper structure, then you can't have it in politics. That's why he talks about Tocqueville and all these others. That's in some ways the arguments also today that how can you have, such drastic economic inequalities and still insist on the principle of political equality. That if you don't have it in one, you can't really have it in the other. It's a kind of again, it's a presupposition. It's not something that is completely unconnected. So he argues against Arendt and her reading of these things, but and again, yes, the question of living labor is important because in both cases we talk about we're talking about creation. We're talking about creation. I mean, and what is, it goes back to the 1844 manuscripts or these other things, and also later the stuff on when he talks about, before he wrote this, but the social worker, let's say, or later on this question of multitude and virtuosity. How, the virtuosity that we gain in the, let's say, in the modern capitalist world, which brings out our creative, and moment as part of the efficacy or our productiveness within capitalism. That is a fundamental moment, and when you have that creative dimension when it comes to labor is also, the recreating the political world is also a matter of living labor. It's also a matter of creation, as opposed to simple mechanical, let's say, reproduction of some sort.
I took his argument to be that, and it's interesting because when we think about the French Revolution, it's like often we're thinking about it as the Girondins against the Jacobins and that kind of whole struggle, and he's focusing on the activity of the sans-culottes. And he's saying that it's not as if they arrived on the scene with preconceived understanding as workers and the have-nots as to how the economic order of society ought to be organized. And instead, I think what he's saying is that as they're engaged in the revolutionary activity, they actually encounter bourgeois time as the working day, as a limit that they encounter, and they realize that it's my goodness, it's I want to keep doing and being engaged in these activities, but I can't, right? And sure, maybe that's a good starting point. And then so he talks about, and as a result, they start trying, the process of trying to rearrange the economy on that basis. Is that just the argument? And that's why for me how kind of a Marxist analysis then melds into this is a question, because that's not really present here so much insofar as I guess they come to an organic understanding of the structure of a capitalist economy, because then they realize that they're workers and their time is dictated by the structure of the capitalist economy. Is that kind of the extent of it?
That might be part of it, but I don't think that's the main issue. On the one hand, you have later or not even later, but when he goes back to Marx and he goes back to the Jewish question and the German ideology, I think even more, there's this question of the universality, in a sense, of the working class and its capacity. But when he talks about the movement from structure to subject, let's say, then it's once you become active, then that participation itself constitutes, let's say, what had been the working class into the revolutionary subject. You have to go beyond, of course, that moment where you are a member of the working class. So the example you gave fits into that as well, but it's not simply you become conscious of the limitations that were placed on you by capitalism. You go beyond your position as living labor, let's say, vis-a-vis capitalism, to really being an active creator, agent in the production of the society.
I agree with that. I guess I'm just not sure that the revolutionary agents in this case, like the sans-culottes, necessarily enter even the scene of constituent politics as workers. And I think especially now, if we are thinking about the possibility of new constituent politics, I don't think we could just expect for people to enter the process by first identifying themselves, as workers in a narrow sense.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think that I agree with that. And I think that's not exactly, because you have to go beyond that limitation to fully realize your creative, let's say, capacity. In that sense, it's not dissimilar from someone like Rancière, who says the revolutionary moment for the working classes when they reject their identification as workers and become poets or artists or whatever the case may be. In this case, you don't become a poet; you become a agent of politics, a creator of institutions and laws, or whatever the case may be.
I didn't even really take him to be a Marxist in those respects of workerism or or proletarian or anything. I sort of took it as a sort of structural transformation ultimately, right? I thought this sort of absolute process that he was referring to was more like an open dialectic or fractured dialectic, or even in Althuserian terms, something like the three generalities, or something where you would have this kind of transformation, not in terms of the early Marx, but sort of something in that sort of ruptural Marx or something in a sense. I mean, I don't know, maybe I didn't get to all the way through this section on the dialectic.
Well, he quotes Marx on this question. So if we go to page 224, for example, on this question of
224?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's or it's 224/5. It's the page before that.
224. Okay.
Where he's talking about this kind of, the French Revolution and the bourgeoisie and the working class. It says, first of all, it presents itself as universal class, a class which forms the majority of all members of society, and from which emanates the consciousness of the necessity of a fundamental revolution, the communist consciousness, which may, of course, arise among other classes too, though the contemplation of the situation of the situation of this class. This is from the German ideology, obviously, right? Marx and Engels. The proletariat presents itself in a struggle against the bourgeoisie. The conditions under which definite productive forces can be applied are the conditions of the rule of a definite class of society whose social power, deriving from its property, has its practical idealistic expression in each case in the form of the state. And therefore, every revolutionary struggle is directed against the class, which till then has been in power. Finally, the proletariat presents itself as radical temporality. In all revolutions up till now, the mode of activity always remained unscathed and was only a question of different distributions of its activity. A new distribution of labor to another person's, while the communist revolution is directed against the preceding mode of activity, does away with labor, and abolishes the rule of all classes with the classes themselves, because it is carried through by the class which no longer counts as a class in society, is not recognized as a class, and is in itself the expression of the dissolution of all classes, nationalities, etc., within present society. So he, and it's interesting the way he presents us as going from, let's say, a proletarian or working class thing to communist desire,
Right.
communist desire, which is to, of course, not simply the redistribution, but the complete reorganization by the elimination of these class divisions, nation, and so forth.
Okay.
Is a universal class, and as a universal class, it does away with the particularity of class and the division of labor that it's founded upon. I mean, I think when before this page where he was discussing the limitations of the French Revolution and how it was undone, a lot of it had to do with the division of labor and how that the bourgeois division of labor then becomes reflected in or reified in these political state institutions. Specifically, of course, not only but especially the division between intellectual and manual labor, which in many ways, of course, we find reproduced in all these things. I mean, how many times, people critique AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is just, a bartender. What did she know about these kinds of, it's manual labor. What did they know about these kinds of things?
I've noticed that too, like even in the way I think versus, because also growing up in Russia, I was born in Soviet Union, but growing up in post-Soviet, so it was still a lot of emphasis on working with your hands and then taking pride in working with your hands, versus here, it's almost like something that is below, underneath, and like unqualified people do. And then now even with tipped employees and like that waitress a couple of weeks ago posting a picture of her paycheck, encouraging people to tip more. The line of comments towards that was, why don't you get a real job? So the idea that this is not a real job and this is a job for people who are good for nothing, and then therefore their sufferings can be discredited or not even acknowledged because it's their fault that they chose this kind of profession, without people themselves realizing, well, you are going to bars and then the demand creates the supply of this, and that's what people go into. But yes, well,
it's not just that people discount, manual labor. It's that in the division of labor, the creative moment is taken from them. So, when you're working in the factory or in the kitchen or wherever, you simply follow some preset formula or process. No longer are part of that creative moment in the production of whatever it is, the car or the food or whatever.
Do you think that passage is akin to what we were talking about last week from the Haitian Revolution and everyone being categorized as black after that moment in an attempt to... Does it feel kind of like it corresponds in a certain sense? I'm not familiar with that history enough to know.
Well, I mean, it can be, but I think yes, because in effect, in both cases, it is founding a new way of living. Is not only, of course, that we undo some categories, we get rid of some categories, but it is saying we get rid of whether it's a racialized division of labor or, this division between intellectual and manual labor, that through that you are in effect, reconstituting the society in a very new and radical way. And that it's up to us to do it. That in both cases they realized that we're not obliged to maintain the previous principles or ideas. It's, we can recreate it any way we want, which is again a very fundamental and necessary component of this constituent power. That you are not fettered by the ideas of the past or the institutions of the past. You can completely reform it, whichever way you want.
So, I mean, it could be that maybe I was superimposing some of, my prejudices on the reading, but like in these passages, I think the impression that I walked away with was that not only is Negri saying that a communist constituent politics as revolution would just be going against the society that concretely preceded it, but that it would in a sense be like undoing the contradictions of all previous societies.
Well, in this case, it's saying you go beyond class. You eliminate the distinctions of class by reorganizing, by undoing the division of labor that we've inherited. I think in this case, especially the division between intellectual and manual labor, especially that division is fundamental, because you cannot have some people that don't have that creative moment to their lives, that are excluded from the intellectual, the creative moment, and simply are, become instruments in a sense. They're not full subjects.
So I guess for me, in a sense, the question becomes, is, this possibility of undoing the division of labor inherent just within constituent politics as such, or is it possible here, again, because he's bringing in a kind of an exterior theory of historical development that we see in Marx? I guess that would be kind of the question for me. Does it resonate as to why that would be important? Because I'm trying to think of a way, I'm questioning whether or not I can hold on to a theory,
Right.
like this without the baggage of, I think, a progressivist understanding of history, which I personally reject.
The kind of historicism that you go through the stages, and you have capitalism, then capitalism creates a situation where you can then transform to it. I don't think it's historicist, because first of all, it's not some kind of mechanical process that he's sketching out. He's just presenting a logical relationship that you have to be able to have this radical democratic society. You have to be able to go beyond this division of labor. The division of labor kind of handcuffs limits the possibilities of the society. So how can the French Revolution have turned out otherwise, given the division of labor that characterized French society at that moment? It was, in that sense, it is not a kind of staged thing of history, but it's saying that the material conditions are fundamental, and you cannot just will something into existence where the material conditions are this. You have to concurrently transform that materiality of that society. Let's say, in this case, the everyday lives, lived experiences, and the division that we still have, of course, and it was even more true then, certainly, between intellectual and manual labor.
So
how are you going to be a creator
Right.
if all your life you simply function as an instrument of production?
Right. So the process isn't this totalizing process of going through each of these stages to arrive at communism in the end.
Yeah. I don't think
concrete
that's the
condition,
reading
basically,
here.
right, yes.
I don't think that's the reading here.
Yeah.
But it's saying
Specific to what, sir?
The situation, the concrete situation, ultimately, it changes all the time. It's an open process that continuously evolves, never ends. In fact,
Not teleological.
right?
Yeah. And again, I think if you read someone like Rancière concurrent to this, it's also a similar moment in time, certainly. The Knights of Labor is a very similar point, that these people who were workers, rebelled against the reduction of themselves to workers and became active creators within that society.
What's the book?
The Knights of Labor. NIGHTS. Not the other kind of knights. But it's about cobblers in Paris, people who make the shoes. And how at nighttime they would be poets or, a movement where they would, write poetry and participate in these various things. And how revolutionary that is as them kind of rejecting or going beyond their identity as workers. But again, this is fundamental, that you cannot be a citizen, let's say, right? A member of a constituting assembly or moment, and then the rest of your life you are passive, reduced to being an instrument. That when you have that, it becomes, you have a problem. So you have to transform, you have to undo that division of labor to have the real possibility of avoiding
Right, you
those.
can't be one way and
No.
you can't have your life
No,
segmented, divided, closed off. You can't be one way in one part of your life and then suddenly become an active subject in
That's
your
right.
own.
Although, I guess for me it raises one question, which is just the understanding that we have of the division between manual and intellectual labour is contextualised by a capitalist system that kind of casts them in that, with that dualism. Whereas I can imagine a scenario where it's possible to do what we now call manual labour, right? Say something physical, whatever.
Right.
And do that all the time and still have an intellectual life,
yes.
even if that's all you do. So when we talk about getting rid of that division, I guess for me at least, I'm trying to understand, are we talking about, everyone is doing a bit of everything, like both, or is it still possible to have people, like in the context that you were describing, who do, whatever it is the thing, building something or, concreting or whatever it might be. That's their work, they take pride in that contribution and what have you, but it doesn't, the fact that is the work that they do and the contribution they make doesn't impede their ability, So in that sense, you still have a division of labour, it just is not functioning in the same way. Like we'll still have means of production, but it won't function in the same way, and after capitalism.
First of all, is the question of the production process itself. And the split there, because that in itself embodies a split between intellectual and manual labor. So it's a difference between, let's say, working in a factory that produces a chair and being a carpenter that makes the chair. Where you have the creative control, let's say, over how you make the chair versus you're on the assembly line and the creative moment is completely outside of you, and all you are basically is an adjunct to the process or the machines, let's say. So that's one. And then another one is, whether these people are active and participate in in the creation or recreation of their communities. Because you can be a carpenter, let's say, and it can be foreclosed to you, and you don't fully realize that creative capacity that you have. You only do it in relationship to, let's say, the things you produce. But you are in a passive situation in terms of the society as such, or the community as such. So it says it's something about, first and foremost, how the production occurs, and then, of course, how you relate to the society more broadly. So obviously we'll have to get rid of the technical division of labor that exists, or do it in ways in which the people are active in the design and thinking about whatever you want to, of what is being produced.
Oh, that's really
That's the distinction you make between living and dead labor, essentially?
Yeah, dead labor is simply labor that has already been, it's capital.
Right.
Right? The Grundrisse Mark says, the only distinction between labor and capital is time.
Right.
Capital is dead labor. Is labor that has already been expended and takes the form of a machine, or whatever, a building,
Right.
whatever the case may be. So that's dead labor. Living labor is,
Just
people.
the physical living.
Right.
Okay,
Or-
so that's not
or
what
you-
he's
yeah, or
saying.
very. So in that sense too, in a sense, you could say, look, in politics, these institutions or these, they're simply dead struggle.
Mhm.
You know, if capital is dead labor, then the state, let's say, or these institutions are dead struggle. And the question is, how can you keep the living struggle from being subsumed by the dead struggle?
Mhm.
You know, how can you keep the same way with living labor and dead labor? How can you keep the primacy of that, you know, and not simply have it on occasion when you have these moments of founding, you know, on the politics. My friend Andreas Calivas has a good book on this, The Politics of the Extraordinary, which is about foundings, you know, these moments of foundings. It goes back to Max Weber, Hannah Arendt, and Cornelius Castoriadis as the main figures. So it's not just the extraordinary moment, let's say, but it becomes a constant that living labor or living struggle is in control, let's say, and not subsumed by the dead moment.
So the struggle is the moment to recreate something whereby you're not replicating that dynamic where state institutions become dead
But
struggle.
again, there is a tension and a problem because on the one hand, you need to maintain, right, the power to change in any way, you know, that might be possible. On the other hand, it's not always, of course, a good idea to make changes or some changes. So there has to be a kind, I mean, that he doesn't really talk about this here, but a kind of self-limitation or self-regulation. It's a difference between you have a limitation that occurs from the outside, from the dead, let's say, right? As opposed to a limitation that you impose on yourself. You know what I mean? So there has to be some notion of you can't, if something happens and there is, you know, the fear of a plague or virus or something, and you say, okay, let's put all the Chinese people into camps. You know what I mean? There has to be the mechanism that you have to be, you are responsible for what you say and how you act, and you have to maybe police yourself to not say the stupid things. And if you say the stupid things, then, like for example, in ancient Athens, what was the mechanism? If a citizen suggested something or came up with a proposal that after the fact people realized was a bad idea, right, was bad, they can be kicked out.
Oh.
Yes,
That's a good one.
they can be
We
kicked
can
out.
do that.
Wasn't the
But then how do
punishment,
you ever get?
didn't you say the punishment was worse than being kicked out? That they could
There's
actually...
nothing worse than being kicked
Yeah,
out.
no, you're not in society anymore. You're like
Yeah, there's no way
death,
to get
basically.
one.
Death.
Yeah.
You go to a different
Socrates
Essentially
chose
death.
death over being
Yeah,
kicked
you don't
out.
want to get
Yeah.
Right.
But doesn't it have a somewhat icing effect on like?
Well, but
like,
you
you know
have
what I mean?
to-
Like if that's the risk
Yes,
you
you
have
have
for
to be-
advancing
yeah,
ideas,
true.
You
might
have
stop
to be
advancing
thoughtful,
ideas.
yeah, rather than,
A chilling effect on.
Say something stupid on Twitter
Yeah.
about concentration camps.
right. But you see, there, it's not that there is, you know, some rule and some law that eliminates what's possible. Okay, everything is possible, but you have to be thoughtful and, you know, try to be true to the fundamental principles of the community before you come up with, you know, some suggestion, some proposal, especially at times of crisis, where maybe people are more easily persuaded or have, you know, towards something that in hindsight might not have been a good idea.
Harsh. You know.
I don't know, there's something
Well,
to
there's
be
some
said
exceptions
for
for
it.
good
But
faith
that's
efforts
a
to try and solve a
yeah.
problem.
That's a mechanism of limitation and control where it's not external, it's internal.
Yeah, it's into yeah.
Right, just essentially feeling responsibility for your actions, which is
Yeah,
not
don't
unreasonable.
yes, don't just
Yeah.
say anything, any
Yeah.
stupid thing. You know, you say something stupid, you know, then okay, maybe
Price.
they'll have to be, you know, or they could just take away your right to participate, or they could kick you out of the city.
Just having this unsupported confidence, I guess, that a lot of people have. Just saying things and proposing and then moving forward, just trying to prove something to themselves. And even when things don't work out, they're not willing to let go and then rather still reassert their,
Stay the course.
Yes.
You just blame someone on
Yeah.
social media.
Yeah. I think blame someone. But then this idea, I kind of like this idea that everything is an experiment and everything is wrong. It's just some things are less wrong in some degree. So, and then just from
I don't know
that-
if everything is wrong, because there are ideas or suggestions or let's say changes you want to make that, in some ways, we could say, and this is not made explicit, that there's a difference between, let's say, a popular or populist political logic and a democratic one. Because the democracy is not just the majority rules, let's say. It's not just we have a constituent assembly and whichever way most people vote, that's the right way. That there are some foundational, let's say, normative principles about, to begin with, the virtues of democracy, let's say, or the desire for democracy over other forms. That some decisions are in line with those principles, and some may be contrary to those principles. And if you use your participatory agency to come up with things that are counter to the foundational principles, then you've made a mistake. And you might have to pay for that mistake by being kicked out or whatever the case may be. But, it's not just the majority rules, that there's a qualitative dimension to it, And you can be populist and not be democratic, let's say. You can be popular and not be democratic. If we ask people today, most of the Americans about many things, they would come up with, I'm sure, some ideas that from the standpoint of, let's say, democratic principles, we would find to be incompatible. Most of the time, this is the Machiavellian logic. Machiavelli understood that, of course, the multitude can be wrong, but the chances that it's wrong is much less than the chances that the few are wrong or the one is wrong. The collective intelligence of the many is always superior, he says, to the cleverness of the few or the one. It doesn't mean that you cannot make a mistake. Of course, it's possible that the many also make a mistake. It's possible, but that's the less possible, less likely than the few. And then, like I say, this example I gave from Athens, they had a mechanism for trying to limit the mistakes that the many can make. So they themselves could be the judges of what they had done in the past, and and that becomes a way through which you have a kind of regulation of the principles. But it's not some kind of, we have, I think here the constituent power is not just that you have majority rule. That's not enough. That might be true, but that's not enough. There has to be this qualitative, normative part, which includes in this case, that you reconstitute the division of labor. You cannot have this kind of.
I know we already kind of talked about this at our last session, and we talked about the kinds of economic arrangements, that might be compatible with, this type of an exercise of constituent power. It's like, the division of intellectual from physical or manual labor is, definitely an important one. But I think it also goes for just division of labor in society more generally. Just thinking about, is this type of an exercise of constituent power going to be compatible with, say, the extensive types of regulatory apparatuses, that we have today. And I raise that because that gets to the question about scale. And at what levels, this might be practicable. And I guess it's also easy to overlook that, even if we give up and, put aside the category of the nation, like we still more or less like live in a system of states, right? And, revolution in one country, question. So what do we do on that basis? And just because, right, I mean, even like the regulation of like the monetary systems is, definitely no longer, confined to a nation anymore. It's not even supranational because it's just like by handful of like, and I don't even know what to call them, right? Like, there are the central bankers, a key number of states, and they're just kind
beyond
of transnational
state control.
oligarch.
Right.
Yeah,
It's like super.
right. And then so like, what does constituent politics, like, how can you control that, or what's the
Well, that would have
relation?
to, all those powers would have to be eliminated,
It's all better.
and again become subservient to the legislative power. That's what I'm saying. When you have in the modern context the privilege you have executive power over the legislative power, it is deviating from, let's say, what a kind of constituent moment would presuppose.
But I guess like this is, and this is I think one of the reasons for not the separation of powers as in checks and balances, but the division of power between the different branches. And that's why like I was talking about like the sheer scope of the regulatory apparatuses, right? If we're literally, talking about anything from environmental regulation to monetary, regulation and, consumer protections and whatnot, like do we literally think that kind of like at the vast scope of like, those institutions in the type of society that we live in today, that a legislative body would have the capacity, just in terms of sheer time. I'm not saying that we would be stupid enough, like, to handle those tasks. It's like, can we handle, in a sense, that level of quote unquote complexity?
Bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Right.
It would have to
Society of
be.
Bureaucrats.
They would have to be. It's not to say that you don't have the institutions and machines to implement, let's say, the decisions. But it means the decision would be yours, not some experts, not some central banker who reads the paper in the morning and decides, let's do X, Y, or Z. So, and that's the reason why they have these central banks, obviously. They don't want those decisions left in the hands of some legislative body because it's unpredictable, or because we might decide to do things that are not necessarily in the best interests of the banks.
So you keep all the structure. Is this the idea, that you keep the apparatus, but you just change who controls all of the apparatus? So you keep a licensing division for hot dog vendors or whatever, and whatever they have to comply with to be, sanitation or whatever, these health codes, different things.
I mean, you might keep the bank or a central bank, or that a place where money is printed, certainly, and all these things. But who controls them or who makes the decisions would not be the same.
But remember we were talking about the issue of expertise last time, right? So let's just like think about like central banks then. So are we saying that, because like I took your idea to be, it's like, well, the central bank like will still continue to exist, but instead of, right, like the president like appointing, right, like the Federal Reserve chair, that it will consist of, I don't know, but like at that point though, then it becomes, it's like, well, there's like a central legislative body, and then there are other like these like subsidiary like bodies.
That would not be. I think that would not be possible in a kind of model where constituent power is always supreme.
I agree, but then I'm like, is this going to be possible?
The central bank we might not need. Maybe another example of something we actually need.
Look, the decision. Basically, what are we talking about? The decision to regulate inflation, let's say, right, or money supply. Correct? So, in a sense, it's not a technical matter. It's a political matter. It's not, it's not a level of technical
expertise. So we're keeping
expertise.
the monetized economy.
No, but if
You are keeping. That's what I'm saying. That's not a great example, because I don't think we're going to need it. But I feel like other forms of regulation we might continue to need, right? Like
no, but in this case, for example, if legislative power were supreme and also determined something like this, we could decide to eliminate all debt by greatly expanding the supply of money, by creating a lot of inflation so we could eliminate debt.
Or just debt forgiveness.
Which has happened in the past. Which has happened in the past. It's not something that, well, it could never. It's happened, in the past, and it was very
Happened in
effective.
53 with Germany.
Yeah, and it happened many times.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
that's why there is something like a central bank where the people who run it are out, beyond the control of the government. Because any given government could decide, how many times does Trump, complain against the Federal Reserve Board saying, they're creating problems for me, they need to lower interest rates and, all these things. You know what I mean? So, and that's a minor issue, but, it could be, of course. So we know why the institutions are set up like that. So obviously, at the minimum, all these things would no longer exist in the same way, in that the legislative moment would always be, supreme. It could always do anything it wanted to do.
Right.
There's a long quote from the Poverty of Philosophy on page 225 that may be of interest. Yeah.
Okay.
On this question of the working class. Economic conditions had first transformed the mass of people of the country into workers. The domination of capital has created for this mass a common situation, common interests. The mass is thus already a class as against capital, but not yet for itself. In the struggle of which we have noted only a few phases, the mass becomes united and constitutes itself as a class for itself. The interests it defends become class interests. But the struggle of class against class is a political struggle. The oppressed class is the vital condition for every society founded on the antagonism of classes. The emancipation of the oppressed class thus implies necessarily the creation of a new society. For the oppressed class to be able to emancipate itself, it is necessary that the productive powers already acquired in the existing social relations should no longer be capable of existing side by side. Of all the instruments of production, the greatest productive power is the revolutionary class itself. The organization of revolutionary elements as a class supposes the existence of all the productive forces which could be engendered in the bosom of the old society. Does this mean that after the fall of the old society there will be a new class domination culminating in a new political power? No. The condition for the emancipation of the working class is the abolition of every class, just as the condition for the liberation of the third estate, of the bourgeois order, was the abolition of all estates and all orders. The working class, in the course of its development, would substitute for the old civil society an association which will exclude classes and their antagonism, and there will be no more political power properly so called, since political power is precisely the official expression of antagonism in civil society. Meanwhile, the antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is a struggle of class against class, a struggle which, carried to its highest expression, is a total revolution.
God, I'm so lost. That was page 225?
Yeah.
It says 224, comma
224,
5
yeah.
at the top. It's actually like the page before it.
So that again is remarks from the Poverty of Philosophy on the universality again of the working class and the class struggle, because again, I mean, we know the argument that in order to liberate itself, it has to liberate everyone. It has to get rid of class as such to undo. And again, that then opens the door to the kind of situation we're talking about, here with Negri, of this constituent, it's not only a constituent moment, but you can have it so that it becomes a kind of continuous process, constant revolution.
What do you think could rile people up, to start re-pursuing the project of constituent politics today?
That's
Revolution.
how do you start? How do you start with yourself first? And then,
I mean, it's also true. It's hard to know how. Because you have to change the subject, like if you change who people are, right? That's who we are. And at the same time, who we are is impacted by like our material circumstances. So like we couldn't possibly practice real democracy now under the current
You
conditions.
have to change, yes, you have
So
to
they have to change both the current conditions and who we are, like, which is a big lift. Like,
It takes an asteroid, it takes a virus, I don't know.
True,
I mean,
true.
yeah, it can
Yeah.
come
It
from
could be
the,
something
it
else.
could be
change
an
it of some
external.
sorts that'll shock us into.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, there's no way that this country can deal with something like coronavirus ultimately, right? It might,
That can be, yeah, that
might
can
be
be.
something that could,
That might be, it might be closer than we
Yeah.
think.
right, right.
Exactly. And sometimes, again, I mean, you know, I mentioned this before, but when Socialism or Barbarism, the journal, folded in 1963,
Why did it fold?
they had all kinds of internal
Disagreements.
limitations
Okay.
and problems, and but Castoriadis wrote a kind of a note about the closing of the journal, and he says, "Look, we live this. France is a very conservative society. The labor movement is dead. You know, bourgeois politics is hegemonic in a way that is almost unthinkable that you could undo it. The only thing we can do is educate."
When was it?
1960, maybe he wrote that in 64.
But that's what Zizek essentially is saying, just learning, right? Is that like kind of cognitive liberation starting from there in a
Yeah,
sense?
in some ways, yeah. But the point is not that. The point is that, 4 years later, you had this great explosion in Paris. You know, you had a real revolutionary moment, a potentiality there that was not visible even to, and these people were not,
Slow.
were not,
Yeah.
they were very, very well educated and very engaged in the political
Yes.
struggles and what was going on. So if they couldn't see it coming, obviously, just a few years before then, things can happen is completely unknown. We don't know what the future can bring. We do know, however, we can though say, well, look at these revolutionary moments and how constituent power was, overcome by these constituted institutions. And I think is a very, when it comes to this question of law and politics, we see a very obvious pattern in terms of how things go the wrong way. And certainly, one is the idea that you limit yourself, you create external limits from which you can, you have to have the radical possibilities always there, always at the forefront. Not to say, well, we don't want anything to change, or we want to make it very difficult for these things to change. Always the legislative autonomy has to be there, that they can make any law they want to make. And it's a problem, it's a problem when you have the struggles from the nominal left, at least, that struggle in the name of legal order. Trump is bad because he's violating the Constitution or violating the law.
Right.
They're struggling in the name of limitation. We should always be limited. So they're celebrating, legal limitation rather than saying, we want to undo this, because once Trump is out and they might be in, again, they'll face all those limitations as well.
Like, how do you think, we can, on the left, engage concretely with the political developments of today, like Trump, right? It's I'm completely, erasing and trespassing, the vision of power by, saying it's oh yeah, my friend Roger Stone, that sentencing was too much. It's let's get the judicial system to do what I tell them to, right? So, how could we still engage with what's going on, but without falling prey, as you say, to just protecting, the transgressed institutional order, but without just saying, oh, it's all about we need a revolution. I mean, and we might agree with that, but like how, so like what other, in a sense, I guess, principles of, organization, like do we put forward as a new framework, right? And then that's why, like, I feel like oftentimes the critique remains imminent to the system, because you still want to be able to communicate with people. So how do you do that while still overcoming those limitations?
And get people to listen, because at times a lot of the comments are dismissed as being too radical. It's like, oh yeah, sure, let's start a revolution, and then there's like everything you said, it just passes right.
Well, I mean, in this case, rather than defending constitutionality or law, you could assert, you could defend legislative over executive, for
I think
example.
that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
even institutions of dead struggle are still institutions of dead struggle, right?
Yes.
So like, even if you think that they're encapsulating something that is now become unproductive, shall we say, or is no longer
Or
helpful.
the struggle is
The struggle
omnipresent,
that was
so the
there, so,
let's say the relation of power between these institutions is not fixed. It was not always true, of course, that executive power in the United States was the preeminent moment. For a long time, Congress or the legislative moment was the most important, the most fundamental. But that changes, for example. And there are all kinds of arguments as to why that happens and how that happens. But at a minimum, it can be, because what do we see? When the Democrats, of course, had the presidency, they did not use that moment to try to undo, executive, the amassing of executive power. They did it even more. Obama had, gained the right to assassinate American citizens, as we know, outside the United States, which was new. That was a new addition to, let's say, this arsenal of executive power that is all the time being amassed. And Trump has continued, of course, that process. So there's no struggle to reformulate the relations of power between the institutions.
And even if you would reject representative democracy, like if you were fashioning a new society, you might just, you might say representative democracy is undemocratic inherently in a certain sense. But to the extent that that's what is there right now, it's more democratic than other alternatives, right? And so it also creates an opening for something.
If the legislative moment, in fact, did the legislation.
Yes.
Because as you know, with these institutions, what do? They give the legislating power to these various agencies. It becomes technicalized, it becomes the domain of experts, and the legislative body simply becomes a rubber stamp, or, they oversee things in a sense, but they don't actually do the legislating.
But so here's a question. So let's say, we did take these moves. Then don't you think, though, going back to our discussions about, legalism and legalistic, or just institutional, politics, then, aren't we then saying, and I like this possibility, that we could still engage in institutionalized politics, but, with a kernel of meaningful transformation?
There's no question, right?
Yeah.
No one is saying that you don't participate. There's no possibility of not having institutions. Always there are institutions. There is always an instituted moment in any society, in any kind of political regime, and so forth. And the fact that we find ourselves, for good or bad, at this moment in time, dealing with these realities, does not mean that then, we can't, we're not going to do anything beyond, reading a few books and, talking about some things. But
Like-minded individuals.
But again, right, it points to some of the pitfalls and the problems. Again, I'm of the mindset, and I'm in the minority, that for me, the most productive response to the current problems would be to declare our autonomy. To liberate New York City, for example, right? The New York City to liberate itself from the United States.
Secession.
USA out of NYC. To kick out the Americans, and reconstitute ourselves, let's say, as this democratic moment.
But would
And I think
would the
cities-
bankers stay?
Well, it's like Jackson Rice, right? Like to go back to what
Yeah,
we
yeah.
were talking about
Yeah.
last
Are
week.
we a city of immigrants or a city of bankers?
Well, the bank, well, we'll see.
I know,
You know,
'cause honestly,
we'll
not- there's a lot
constitute
that's
ourselves,
outraged.
we'll see how it's going to be. But is, you know, the difference between being passive and being active, or, you know, saying we are, you know, we here, we live in the city, we are in charge, and we're going to decide how, like the Paris Commune, of course. I think there's something about cities that allows for a greater possibility of democracy than other forms of living. Something about that density, about living together, about the interactions.
Yeah.
And when you abstract it into something like the United States as such, it becomes very, very, you know, I think impossible really to say you have the United States of America and you can transform the United States of America into some kind of democratic
Yeah.
society.
But then, I mean, it does create that challenge that the cities don't produce. Like, you know, in their current formation, right, the cities are not productive. You know what I mean? So
We would
you don't
starve,
have what
you're
we
saying.
we're gonna
Yeah.
starve, we're just literally not going to be able to
Yeah.
reproduce ourselves.
Well, we could have, you know, alliances.
Yeah.
Right, we can have alliances with, you know, Puerto Rico and with California and other places. We do have a lot of money.
Yeah. The money's passing through. Yes. Yeah.
Maybe we could annex part of upstate, you know, keep the water supply going.
Well, that's the
Some
other
of
thing. Yeah,
the
the water is
dairy
coming from
farms or
upstate,
something,
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
But then
once the
it-
state and interstate relations, though, become quote unquote national relations, and
Right.
not to throw cold water. I like because I like the idea a lot. So but I also agree, and I think like also at the level of creating democratic subjectivities, like, you know, less radical than that, but like, you know, even like, you know, creating new spaces of mutual democratic engagement. So we actually like, you know, become accustomed to the practices of autonomy, of like listening to one another, respecting one another. I think would go a long way as well.
Like workplaces,
Yeah.
because a lot of people spend time at work, and then it includes a lot of effective labor, right? Presenting yourself to the people, acting in a certain way,
Yeah.
like knowing the limitations that you should not go to this boss because he's too high up and too important with other things, and asking other people. So it's like the whole way of relationship at work is already mediated by this. So maybe starting there.
We
at
would put strict
workplaces.
limitations on working.
Yeah.
Would not allow more than.
Yeah, that would be nice. That would be nice. Because it's clear. It's encouraged everyone.
Right.
This
That's one disagreement I have with all this, you know, work, you know, is like, you know, oh, we'll make life in the factories more democratic. We'll get rid of, you know, how about we end it? Or
well, it's just.
it's okay to be a little bit democratic, but it doesn't solve the problem.
But I mean, even like how creative work, people get together and talk about launching different programs, and then just the way you do that can be changed. Like more people have voice in that say, you know. So just starting from there, I think it would be very helpful.
Yeah, of course.
And then
But you're
of course,
talking about
like,
now,
you know,
like
I'm
now.
talking about now, and then
Yeah,
I'm
not in
also
this
thinking
hypothetical society.
because
Yeah.
right now there's this.
That's
art-
not any less idealistic in a sense,
No, I think
or
it's super
crazy.
idealistic because the
because
whole frame
because
structure
if
of work is
how you're
like,
going to pull that off in the, you know,
antithetical
with
to that.
contemporary power relations, how could you ever have a
Yeah.
workplace where
That's
the
right.
bosses gave up that kind of power?
And the kind of
That's more
productivity
crazy
that
than
is
saying we're going
required.
to kick out the Americans from New York City.
Yeah, because you know we require certain levels of productivity in
Yeah.
all spheres right now. So what you're
Yeah.
suggesting is somewhat antithetical to the kind of productivity that is required, right? And
Well,
productivity.
yes.
is, you know,
Like for example, I'm learning. I'm just joining all kinds of organizations, like voluntarily, and then I'm working on different programs, and then just the way how they work on them, I'm realizing that I can do any one of these, and then it's like because it's free, you know, voluntary, so I have so much autonomy in having conversations with whoever I want to have conversations and do it. But at a workplace that is meant to produce a profit and, you know, is considered a workplace, you don't encounter that same dynamic unless you work in nonprofit and get
even
crazy
then,
underpaid
even
and
if
doing
it's not for
million other
profit, it
things.
has the same dynamic. The productivity is like
Right.
infused across everything.
Yeah,
There is
yeah.
nothing that's functioning outside
Right.
of productivity model. I think even a co-op workers'
Yeah, and
cooperative or
the
whatever.
question of who
It's still
controls
functioning
the
with
working
under a
day
certain
and the
amount of
temporalities and so forth.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's already, it's more realistic to
To
have the revolution.
yes.
I think that's the answer, honestly.
I mean, it's not like you couldn't try to do it. It's just the question is like, then what? Where to from there? To like, what is the objective? Like, sure, you would be practicing,
But sure,
changing
but-
your subjectivity.
Yeah, so like, or mainly empowering others' subjectivity. So just empowering others, making them feel like their voices count, and then also opening up different possibilities where they can, you know, succeed and realize themselves, and again, different projects and different. So it's just giving the power of voice and meaning to the person. Like, I really love this idea. How do we do that?
But
So,
maybe the better way to think about it would be outside of the work context, right? Like, this is the challenge, right? Because I think, you know, ideally we would practice those kinds of things
Yes.
through the mechanism through which we're reproducing ourselves, which is through our work or whatever, and it would be part of our data. But the challenge is, I think, that actually the whole structure is not set up in a way that enables that. Like, but then, you know, we do have people create spaces outside of the work that they do to reproduce themselves. Fewer and fewer, because now people have to work longer and longer hours to actually reproduce themselves. But still, people do. People go to tenant association meetings or go to different community meetings. You know, they create spaces. The problem is sometimes those spaces do not reflect what you're describing, right? And I think we could actually, those spaces actually, we could do that, right? We could have more democracy, we could have less hierarchy, we could practice, you know, whatever kinds of structures and justice kind of models we want to do. And they don't do that. So that's a thing I think we actually do have control over, where we could actually be doing more.
Yeah.
There's smaller and smaller spaces, so that's the
Yeah.
challenge, right? And people come to them with low energy and you know,
Level
not
of
enabled educationally and whatever but we could do a lot more with those.
I mean, but like to maybe, you know, think about Tatiana's idea like a little bit more. Like Mondragon, for instance, like, you know, has like lots of problems, you know, definitely. But if we were to kind of like, you know, maybe think about developing a cooperativist like strategy, and, you know, not along the lines of like, you know, like the park, you know, slope food co-op or anything. You know, but if we were to create like workers, you know, cooperatives, and like if they were just inserted into the overall economy, like I don't think it would stand a chance. And so we would need, you know, some scale and some interaction. But yeah, like there are challenges, absolutely. But, you know, if like, you know, activists and, you know, people, you know, on the left are willing to go down that road, I mean, I think it would be really
There's
great.
also like going back to your city model, I mean, it's also, I think, like New York City is maybe like, even though it seems like it's a really good city for it, maybe it's not a great choice, right? Like when they chose Jackson, they chose it very strategically in terms of what they could defend militarily based on the physical kind of geography of the place. It has a water supply, it has like all these different things that can actually, you know, just militaristically be effective.
Yeah.
You know, so maybe we look outside
But
New York.
but we're the ones who are here. We would be advantaged because they would have to come from the outside to.
Yes, true.
We wouldn't have to
Home
build that many
advantage,
walls.
yeah.
You know, we
Yes.
have.
Yeah, oh, wow.
We
Yeah,
can
no, that's
defend the
fine.
towns and
We
the
would run
bridges,
starting
right.
and
We
on
need
water and
not
on, you
that
know.
many.
Yeah, whereas if you have a city where you actually have your own food, water supply, like, you know what I mean, you have the things you need to live, plus you can defend it militarily, that's kind of helpful, right? Like, you actually don't need the money. You don't need the trade, you don't need, you know what I mean? Like, you just
Oh, we're all about trade, you know, New York City. We're not gonna. But that's why you need a kind of confederation of,
yes, and then you need a
kind of
confederation,
autonomous
allies,
communities. Right.
yeah.
I mean, you cannot survive simply on. Well, maybe you could, but that's not the ideal. You know,
Maybe
you
not.
have to have.
Maybe there's
you know.
an island.
We got the other islands that we'll have, you know, from Puerto Rico and from
Yes.
Crete. You know, we'll get the Cretans. But what you say is what they call prefigurative politics. That you kind of, you know, prefigure in the form, in the organizational form, that final output that you desire, as opposed to saying, well, we're going to be hierarchical and, you know, top down. But then when the revolutionary comes, then we'll all be equals.
Yeah, I don't think there's any other way personally. So
So always you have this kind of prefigurative moment as a possibility, let's say, in how you organize. But then the question is, what is that? But I guess we're all waiting for the
Yes.
revolutionary moment to.
The asteroid.
I'm not mentally there. I'm more like thinking, how do we get there?
Yeah.
I'm before even discussing that, I'm like, how do we create this mass movement? How do we get to this moment? So and then I love this idea of individual empowerment and like just people like having security in their voices, because more often than not, people who are secure in their voices have things that they have to say.
That's really interesting, except I don't then go from saying that you often do are motivated to participate when you are like not in a place of power, but I don't think, for me, I don't go from there to like individual transformation necessarily. And like I do, like Jackson is an interesting example. I know there are new experiments like now in Detroit as well, but just because that's like been so blighted and they're under so much attack, like even actually in Greece, it was in a place called, I think, Nea Ionia. And in like the small township, they experimented with their local alternative currency, like called TEM. But I think those experiments often.
It's a neighborhood in Athens.
It's outside of Athens, because I actually did.
It's part of.
But like I think those things like often happen like when places like fall outside of these like huge matrices of control, and then that's where like I think there is like energy and
places that are in the process of being of decomposing.
Exactly.
Because it's that moment of disorder that creates certain possibilities. Now what happens is an open question, because many times it just goes from bad to worse. It's not a given that you have, like the old Maoist line that, right, everything under the heavens is in disorder. That can happen and things get worse, but that's a Machiavellian moment too, that you have to have the disorder to have the creation of something new, like we say with the asteroid. But I think in that case also, it's not enough that you have, like in the case of Greece and other places, or Detroit, that things get worse. That, because some people think, as things get worse, people will finally wake up and start rebelling against the situation, and that doesn't happen. If anything, oftentimes it's even worse. They become more servile and more willing to accept more and more domination than fight back. But so that's not enough that people's living conditions get worse. Something has to disrupt the normal, everyday routines and processes and institutions. And open up that possibility to the new, whatever that might be. Whether that's a mass uprising and new people taking over. It's the asteroid. It's whatever virus or whatever the case may be.
I think this is one point where I actually did disagree a little bit with Negri, and it's like this utter insistence on rupture and the new, and orientation towards the future as opposed to the past. I do think it's absolutely true that we want to break away from these dominant institutions, but like I think also, what are even like mass movements and not to bring in Bernie, so let me not bring in Bernie. But like if we are like now form counter institutions now, I think those are actually the basis upon which should times of confusion and disorder come, that we could build on again, these like practices and even maybe dispositions and like willingness and like knowledge and to act autonomously. That we could move on. So I don't think it's a complete rupture.
I think even with Bernie, something like getting rid of student debt, let's say, or Medicare for all, that would, that's not a revolutionary rupture, obviously, but it's something that opens the door more for the future, because, if you're not bogged down by the problem of debt, let's say, right? Or if schooling isn't reduced to a calculation of you invest in yourself and you have to borrow this money, so you need to study something that you can pay it back within, But that in of itself is a movement in a new, towards a new situation potentially. at least it creates the groundwork for some new possibilities. It's not revolutionary, but it helps in the possibilities.
And then it could go in different directions, right? So it could have a placating and kind of effect, or an effect of kind of creating comfort that kind of means people don't feel any great urgency around circumstances that don't affect them, or it could.
I mean, think of how when universities were free in the UK, for example. Not only they were free, but if you were from the lower income levels, they would give you money as well. You would get a grant. Because it's not just enough to be free. How are you going to live? How are you going to pay your rent and get food and so forth? And then look at what people studied. And some people studied, accounting or something, but a lot of people went to art. They were working class people. They go to art schools. They study, and they become intellectuals or artists or musicians or what have you, which now becomes much more difficult because, again, you have that. It's money. You have to pay a lot of money. You have to borrow the money. It engenders a different kind of calculation and way of thinking about it. So that would be, I think, I don't think it's a revolution, like some of the people in the DSA talk about the revolution. But it would, of course, it would be a positive step. It would be a positive step. Open the door to some new possibilities. And then they'll give us the guns, and then
There you go.
That's not actually what I was thinking about with regard to Bernie. I was just thinking that, it's like to the extent that like we can, maybe rely on like, even like, the grassroots, like, movements and like the energization of communities, because I mean, I don't have firsthand experience, but it does at least seem like his campaign strategy has been to like tap into existing kind of like community, like, networks, and we could like build up that infrastructure more. So that's what.
But again, there's a difference between building up people's capacities and people acting. There's some of that, obviously, as opposed to, like I get messages every day. I'm sure you do too. Send us another $27 or $50. That's a different kind of participation than we hit the streets together. And so I see more of that part, this part of it. But okay, I mean, it doesn't have to be everything.
And also, like, what he's capitalizing on, shall we say, for want of a better word, or sort of energy, like deploying, like, kind of is already, like, like just take the Nevada, situation, right? Like, you've got all these organizations that are not funded, not-for-profit organizations that are then bringing people, doing, and then you've got the, they're usually like let's say the Make the Road example, it's like a funded not-for-profit C3 organization that has a political action wing, right, like a C4 structure. So they go, they do all the get out the vote, they get all the people, they're sort of like, but then where does that go, right? Then maybe they vote. But after that, all of that has been kind of built, shall we say, that energy, that political energy, that political participation leaves because there's not like any vehicle for it in, and then everything gets concentrated in that candidate.
And here I would agree with Sartre that, the logic of the political logic of the voting is one of seriality.
Yes.
So, I think there are some potentialities there, but the participation as voters is not where that potential is. That's in any, in some sense it's is working to disorganize the possibilities rather than help them.
I mean, like, I do agree that, like, the imperative of organizations, community or political, at the community level should be to build power and not influence. This is why, like, within the DSA, like, I was against the Nixon endorsement, and, they are often, like, turning into these electoral machines, which I don't think is salutary, for the movement on the left. I guess it's just that, like, now I am looking for, like, looking at, like, what's happening with the Sanders campaign, and I'm like, well, maybe that's not how it's working, but, can, like, we build, like, genuine movement and, still cooperate? And I don't know who would take that up, so certainly not the political wing of the, the C3s, but, And
it does open the door, let's say, if people see success there, then it does open the door to the recognition that, yes, we can decide what policies we prefer, as opposed to what now is dogma, the Thatcherite line that there is no alternative, that kind of market forces dictate. We have to cut taxes because otherwise we won't be competitive vis-a-vis other economies. And rather than, Apple bringing their money back here, they'll keep it in Ireland or the Cayman Islands or whatever.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So now it seems to dominate that anyone who suggests that you could do the kinds of things that Bernie wants to do, they are completely unrealistic. They don't realize that we have to deal with the markets, and the markets more or less dictate what's possible and not possible. So on that level, I think it can have also a very radical kind of an effect, that people realize, well, no, we can decide that we want X, Y, or Z policy, and it doesn't matter what the markets. That's why the virus thing is so interesting in some ways, because if the markets are crashing and there's a kind of crisis, it opens the door to many more possibilities, than would be otherwise, because you don't have to deal with then the problem of capital flight, or you're endangering the investor confidence, and Bernie wins, and they try to mitigate, the effect of Bernie by pulling the money. If already it's crashed, then you're going to
Maybe
So maybe it's good timing.
I know, it's like timing, right? Timing is everything.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.